All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. This is I think the 10th or 12th time that we've hosted these virtual conversation series. And we started them just because we all weren't meeting in person for so long back in the early days of pandemic, which seems like 10 years ago, but also you can feel all the yesterdays that have happened since that started, I'm sure. But we wanted to be able to offer this opportunity to reimagine how we deliver engaging leadership programs to students as leadership educators through these virtual platforms. I think Zoom and virtual platforms are familiar to all of you, but here's some guidance on how to use the platform in case anyone needs it. Maybe Zoom isn't your platform of choice, but some familiarity here and how to change your name. We will have a couple polls that we'll display for you here in a couple minutes that you can respond to, just to give our facilitators some context for who's in the room with us as well. As we get started, I do just want to offer a land acknowledgement as we begin our presentation and thinking about the lands that we're on, or the original homelands of Indigenous and tribal nations. I'm here in central Illinois, which is land of Kickapoo and Potawatomi First Peoples. And so for you all and where you're joining us from, to give thought to the ancestry and the generations that came before you as well. At LeaderShape, if this is your first time joining us and you don't know anything about LeaderShape, I thought I would offer the vision and mission statement of our nonprofit organization. Our vision is a just, caring, and thriving world where all lead with integrity and a healthy disregard for the impossible, with a mission to transform the world by growing the number of people who are helping us in that vision. So we welcome you into the LeaderShape community if this is your first time meeting with us, and we hope that you will consider yourself part of our community as well. As a thought starter here, just in thinking about how LeaderShape defines leadership, I thought I would offer that leadership involves living in a state of possibility, making a commitment to a vision, developing relationships to move into action, and sustaining a high level of integrity. Effective leadership takes place in the context of a community and results in a more equitable society. We know that there are lots of definitions of leadership out there, but this is the one that we use for our programs. As I said before, my name is Abby Prince. I'm the Director of Program Quality and Management, and I'm so excited to be joined by these friends that are here to facilitate our conversation here today on being an accomplice in action. So Dr. Bobby Kunstman and then Dr. Raja Bhattar are joining us as well. And friends, if you'd like to introduce yourself a little bit to the group.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here today, and thank you for just sharing space with us and us as a community today. My name's Bobby Kunstman, and I serve as the Director for Student Life and Leadership at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I've been here for about 8 years now, which it's scary how time flies sometimes when you're in one location, getting that itch. But previous to here, I actually call Miami home. And have lived in various parts of the United States, but this is where I'm at now. And I use he, him, his pronouns.
Yay, I'm so excited to be with you all today as well. My name is Raja Bhattar. I use they, them pronouns. I am currently calling in from the land of various Arabic tribes people, also known as Doha, Qatar. And I am, in my day job, a full-time consultant doing equity, inclusion, and diversity strategic planning work with various universities and nonprofits and profit organizations. I also work at American River College as a coordinator for an adjunct faculty for tutoring for the campus of 30,000 students. I'm really excited to talk about this topic. Bobby and I did this presentation a little while ago and wanted to bring it up again as an opportunity to engage in a leadership framework, how we can do this work.
Awesome. Thanks, friends, for that introduction. I will turn things over to you for the rest of our time together as we say, lightly facilitate this conversation. We do invite a lot of comments from folks and friends who are joining us in the room. If you're more comfortable responding in the chat, if you'd like to unmute yourself and share your thoughts verbally, you're welcome to do that as well, to whatever level that you're comfortable with. So Bobby and Raja.
Thanks, Abby. If you can go ahead and go to the next slide. We just want to acknowledge some of the things that are happening in the world. I know we already shared a little bit about where you all are calling in from. we just want to name kind of where Bobby and I are calling in from, the Arabic people tribes here in the Middle East, the Ino and Okanichi people who are in Durham, North Carolina, and all other known and unknown ancestors and people that have led the way for us. While things things may not be in the media, the racial injustice movements, particularly Black Lives Matter, anti-Asian violence, and all the other things that are happening in the world are all very present. I am also thinking a lot about the anti-trans bills that are happening and a lot of the political engagement. And also, in case you're not aware, there's a virus that's still out there, COVID-19, and just the pandemic and the ways that it has impacted inequities in both highlighting but also addressing. And so really complicated relationship with how that's shown up in everything. And also just the fact that it's taken a toll on all of us in many ways. And so just want to take a moment to ask all to take a deep breath to honor that we're still showing up amidst and because of all the chaos that we live in. Just get present. And if you're someone that likes to put your feet on the ground, feel that earth below your ground. And we'll also start off with one of my favorite quotes. If we can go to the next slide. Lila Watson, who's an Indigenous activist out of Australia, says, if you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come here because our liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And I think this is really where we think about moving from allyship to accompliship, is recognize the shared commitment and responsibility and impact and necessity of doing this work in accomplishing beyond allyship. So really excited for that. Thank you. All right.
One of the things, oh, sorry, there we go.
Go ahead.
One of the things I think when we're talking about engaging and facilitated dialogue, we want to also be nimble and be flexible in this space, and we want to be able to address the questions that you all have in mind. And so we've got a few polling questions that we're going to populate in a second. But what we want you to do is, if folks can share, what is a question you are entering into this space with today when you think about equity-minded strategies to being an accomplice, and how to enact and be part of that community towards change. And so as we engage in the conversations, please, if you've got some stuff that you want to put in the chat now, that's great. That will help Raja and I as we plan the dialogue. But also, if you've got questions throughout our conversations, please just enter them into the space, and we will make sure to address those as we can. And with that, we're going to go live with a few polling questions. And Abby's our hero on this front, so I think.
People are responding quickly to this question. So I'll display those results here in a couple seconds. We've got 69% are participated already in this poll. A couple more people responding. We're up to 80%. This is like election night. Okay, and we'll go ahead and end that poll here so you can see people are somewhat comfortable with this concept, which I think is great. You can see those results there. Okay. No one is not at all comfortable. I think that that's comforting. Okay, so we'll go on to our second poll here. Okay, we'll launch this one. How are allyship and accompliship related? Folks are responding to that. I'll be honest, Raja and Bobby, when I saw this poll question, I was like, this feels like a trick. Okay. People are a little slower to respond to this. I see Megan's comment in the chat. She would add another option to this question. What would you like to be added to that, Megan?
I think another one that is somewhere in between, they're not at all related and they're the same thing, because I don't think either of those are true. I would add like they are somewhat related, or they are something like that.
That's fair. That's fair. So a lot of I'm not sures, or that they're not related at all. So we'll hear from our friends, Bobby and Raja, I'm sure, on this topic. And then we'll do our third and final poll question here that I'll launch, which is, I feel comfortable talking about liberatory frameworks in my workplace. Adrian, I see your comment there in the chat too, that they're related, but not the same thing. There's like a Venn diagram kind of overlap there, right? Okay. All right, and with 73% of counties responding, we'll go ahead and share these results here that most people somewhat agree that they feel comfortable, but it's pretty evenly divided, I would say. Okay.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you. This is just a way for us to kind of get to know where people are coming from. And I hear you, Megan, on the question. This is what happens when at 3 in the morning you're coming pulling questions in the airport. So, but I appreciate the addition and modification for that. So let's go ahead and move to just a couple of frameworks for how we think about this work. And so really when we think about liberatory philosophy, yeah, that's perfect. Thank you. I really love the work of Dr. Bobby Haro, who was at UMass Amherst for quite a long time, and has really done quite a bit of incredible work on structural isms and structural deconstructing socialization and liberation and social, so social liberation. And so really, we're not gonna all even go through this. I do a whole semester-long workshop on this, but for now, just recognize that when we think about allyship and accompliship, it's really just a larger framework of liberation philosophy and particularly educational liberatory philosophy, and that we recognize that these are not just individual behavior, but these are systems and structure that are embedded deeply into the normality of our structures and the way we operate in educational institutions. And so when we think about liberatory work, we have to really try to undo the work at an individual, interpersonal, and institutional level, and that we have to take responsibility for all 3 levels to actually do structural and impactful change. And so if anyone's interested in reading the article, it's pretty easy to find online. If not, drop us an email, we'll send you the article. It's great, but to really just think about the fact that liberation philosophy requires us to think at the structural, interpersonal, institutional, and individual level for how we do this work around accomplishing and allyship, and how those are related, and yet not the same. And the next slide is one of my favorite slides that I use in most of my trainings that I do. I think when we talk about oppression and justice work, it's really easy for us to say, well, if we just get people, and Jamie Washington does this really well, Reverend Dr. Jamie Washington. He says, if people often say, like, if people have power and people who don't have power, people often, if we just flip the system, we'll be fine. But what happens is you just recreate a system of inequity, you don't actually undo the system. And so for us to actually recognize that, and what I like about this is recognize that while we often say that there's targets and privilege, or agents and targets, that's only half of the table. If you only address the structural systems, you're not actually taking down the table of oppression. You're only taking down 2 of the legs. The other 2 are still it's a slanted table, but it'll still be there. The other 2 pieces that we have to really address are the ways that we, with our dominant identities or our targeted identities, recreate these systems for the sake of survival, for the sake of normality, for the sake of social isms, whatever. And that this is where a lot of the accomplishing comes in, is recognizing and doing our self-work and understanding how we both contribute to and benefit from these forms of oppression. And that's the hard work for us as educators, because many of us, having done this work for years, is like, well, I'm a good person, I don't do that. And yet often I've had this moment 3 weeks ago, and I was like, oh, I have some unlearning to do around this. This is fascinating. And so just recognize that accomplishing really centers on the right side of the table of that, doing the internalized work, so that we're actually able to show up in ways that are not only beneficial to the communities that we want to support and advocate with, but also to ourselves and our own growth in the process. Next slide, please. And so Bobby and I came up with what we called Accomplice in Action. We both like acronyms, so we're like, let's just take that word and think, well, what are the steps that we use in undoing this process, and what have we learned in our own personal journeys as individuals? What have we learned from working with our students as advisors, and what have we just seen in our field as work that we need to do that are beneficial? And so I'll kick it to Bobby to kind of get us started, and we'll kind of jump back and forth.
So I do love acronyms, and it's higher ed, right? We all love acronyms and overuse them. I think one of the things that I appreciate about thinking about Accomplice in Action in particular is, as we think about these steps and personalizing them to ourselves, it's also that checklist of things that, how do I engage in this work? how can we engage in this work, and how do we hold the communities that we are also a part of to have these conversations. And so the first and foremost, thinking about acknowledge your privileges. There's a lot of time that I think in higher ed, this has been the opportunity for me to continue to do my own work within my own identities, and really understand where I hold power and where I don't hold power. And as I continue to move up in this organization of higher education, I also learned like the power, the hierarchical power that comes, becomes even that much more real. And so I think the question, the third polling question really resonates with me, because it's like, how much can I bring into the space, and how much can I really engage in conversations around change? I'm now in a position that I can actively be that person. I can actively model that for others as well. And so so I think bringing my own identities, understanding who I am, and being able to be comfortable in naming that and acknowledging where my power is and the privilege I have to be able to do that is the first step on this journey.
The second piece, along with acknowledging the privileges, is centering targeted perspectives. And so recognizing where it's important for us to move back and make more space at the table. I think often people who are, well, especially I see this around race, like well-intentioned white folks who are like, well, I need to do this work, so let me take the car. And often we miss the fact that in trying to do the work, we often don't center what the folks who we're trying to support and advocate with and for actually need in the space. So it's like fundraising for blankets when people don't need blankets, right? And yet it's well-intentioned, it just doesn't often hit the impact and intention don't often match up. And so recognizing, and this is a tricky C for me, because there's also a way that I've seen people in privilege use that to say, well, I'm going to let this person do the, I'm going to center you, which also means you're going to do all the work. And I'm just going to sit and say, I did the work by being a good ally because I just stood back. And so this is where the accomplishing and allyship is different, where as an ally, you would actually just take a step back and say, I'm just going to create space for you. But an accomplice says, okay, tell me what's happening, and center that perspective and say, how can I then contribute and use my power and privileged identities to then also contribute to undoing this larger system? And so there's a different level of engagement that I think is important for the conversation.
Challenge your assumptions. So thinking about, we enter into spaces, I enter into spaces quite often, making these assumptions about someone's intent. Who made this decision? Why was this decision made? And that's, a lot of that is really based on the experiences we have. So really thinking about the cycle of socialization that we just saw. There are a lot of things that we have often experienced that lead to those assumptions. One of the things that's also important is to sort of take that step back and not make an assumption. And so sort of give, what's the blank canvas that we can enter into a space for? So as folks are engaging in conversations in that back and forth, we can assume a positive intent, but we also have to take care of ourselves as we're doing this work and take care of others as we're doing this work. So there's a both and in this. And so really it's engaging in that space of just say, okay, what's the potential of what action somebody might have, and challenging as you challenge that. It's not giving a complete grace and not saying, oh, I'm not going to let it go, but I could also prepare accordingly or appropriately, but also being able to move into the next step, which will be, and I'm going to pass that to Raja under O.
And if I want to add one more thing to what you said, Bobby, I think the challenging assumptions also for me is actually kind of a conglomeration of the first two. Is once we acknowledge our privilege and once we actually learn how to center targeted perspectives, we recognize the assumption we make about what their needs may be in a particular space. And so recognize that the challenging assumptions is, when I walk into a room, I had this happen a couple of weeks ago, in a room full of people with disabilities, rather than assuming what they need to feel comfortable, if we're actually able to recognize how often I assume or don't think about stairs or access points or language or interpretations, etc., I learned better to think about how I use privilege to then actually center those perspectives. And we did I did a program a couple of weeks ago where they had interpreters at all three events that I spoke at, even though they were like, we don't know if anyone needs it and no one has told us they need it, but part of our practice is we're going to normalize this and actually make that a part of it. And so challenging is something that we need to only provide access when someone needs it versus making it a normal, for me, is also challenging how we think we do equity work versus meeting a need versus meeting a cultural value. And so then owning the intent versus impact is, again, the acknowledging privilege pieces. While I was on the phone yesterday with, I was in India, and so my mother had some medical procedures, and so I was on the phone with this insurance person, and I recognized that because of just my accent, I get access to things that people in my family don't get. And so when my family was speaking, they were not getting anywhere. So as soon as I picked up the phone, things really shifted. And so while my intent was to help my parents, I also then just reaffirmed from my family that like my English is somehow better and is more effective. And so rather than empowering them to advocate for what they wanted, I took over the conversation, which then really, in a way, disempowered folks who are really good at advocating for themselves. And so and then I had to take a step back and say, oh crap, like how do I do this work in supporting and impacting without taking away agency? And so the intent versus impact becomes, it feels quite trite to say that in justice conversations right now. And yet I think it is the foundational framework for how we do this work in an effective, equitable manner.
Moving from guilt to gratitude. I think one of the things that often comes to mind is when we hold power within our identities, it's also often easy to go down a path where we might feel guilty because of that power. And one of the things, as we're engaging in conversations and we are an accomplice in supporting action and supporting movement, it's really embracing this concept of gratitude, to be in the space, to be able to be part of that movement, to be part of supporting that journey and supporting that change. And so not to linger on the guilt, but to really be in this place of like, I'm grateful for this opportunity to be able to enact something that's positive, that will impact others in a meaningful way. And for those of us that often work with students, we probably navigate when students are just entering this work and it's the first time they're starting to have this conversation, they're often wrestling with this concept of feeling guilty. And the way I like to look at it, it's a gift for me to be able to be here, and it feeds my own soul to be able to do this work. And so really entering into a space of gratitude and really being able to move forward.
Yeah, this next one is one of my favorites, practice mindful breathing. I think often I forget to breathe. I actually got a tattoo to remind myself to breathe because I realized that it's something that we do every day, and yet we often take it for granted. And yet when I'm in the heated moment, when someone calls me out on something, calls me in on something, and I recognize that in trying to be a good ally, I've actually caused harm, I'm trained as a US culture to then want to defend myself or to push back or somehow minimize the hurt that I've made. And so what I find is that practicing just mindful breathing and just recognizing where in my body I'm feeling it will actually help me, one, not take it personally, but also recognize that feedback is a gift, and then help for moving from that guilt to gratitude, right? That mind shift can transform how we approach that conversation afterwards, especially if it's with a student or a colleague or someone from the community. And so that just taking that 1 second to take a breath can actually shift and recognize where our body feels it, and recognize that our body manifests all this energy, can actually transform our ability to not just become an ally, which just becomes a passive. We'll go through what that actually means for us in defining allies versus accomplices, but really the accomplishing means owning my own responsibility and energy and how I contribute to this larger gain, and also the impact of doing that work both for the targeted experience, but also me as someone that's a privileged identity.
I will add, I think Raja does this really well for me. And so when you think about practice mindful breathing, having somebody that can also help support you in that journey as well is really huge, because I am terrible at it. And so Raja is often like, hey, let's just take a moment. Let's breathe for a moment. Let's center ourselves before we have the next level of conversation. So I want to acknowledge, like, always finding somebody to help you with that process, because I know I'm not good at it. I often wait till my Apple Watch tells me breathe. And I was like, oh, okay, it's one of those moments. So that's just
Bobby, if I could add to that too. We talk about that a lot in our resilience program too, because I always think of it as it's such a like quiet internal coping mechanism. I think like no one has to know you're doing it. You're already breathing, but it is such a way to like calm ourselves down in a moment where otherwise we might be like,
And
I
there's
can say
a
having been with my family for a month, I did a lot of mindful breathing as a way to just both survive and also show up in ways that felt like it was in line with my values.
Sure, sure.
and it's amazing how much it helps. So,
Hmm.
lead with compassion and accountability. It is so easy to do this work and be hard on ourselves as we do this work. And so one of the things is it's not to take a step back and say, okay, I'm done. I'm throwing my hands up and I'm not engaging anymore. It's we need to be in this work. We need to continue to do this work. We have to hold ourselves accountable, but we are also not superhuman in this work. Whether it is working as an accomplice, whether it's working within our own identities and trying to also lift those up, right? I think the important part about this is we have to have compassion for ourselves as we do this work. We have to have compassion for others as well as they're doing this work. It's easy to point fingers, whether it's at myself as an individual or at others. But if we come into a space with compassion and we have the compass and we know what direction, that direction keeps us moving forward. That direction serves as a mechanism of accountability, and that's really an important factor in this journey.
I think for me, if I can expand on that a little bit, this is for me, this piece is such a deconstructing whiteness, a deconstructing of white Western framework piece of this work around liberation work, where one of the weakest parts of higher ed, I think, is that we are not taught how to build our own sensory system around when and how to be a compassionate, when and how to be accountable, and how those are related and how those can be divergent, and how to actually create a space that feels it's nurturing to the growth of the people that we work with, the folks that we're supporting, the folks we're uplifting. And so the leading with compassion sounds easy, and sounds like those are two big buzzwords just tagged together. We'll actually go through a definition a little bit about how that actually can show up in spaces, because I do feel like it's the understanding the balance of where and how they can show up in different contexts, and our own need for that and our own ability to address that and show up in that space can actually be one of the most important places in moving from allyship into an accomplice-based liberatory philosophy, because it actually allows us to humanize the people that we work with and humanize the processes that we're going through. Bobby and I, when we do training, we talk about progress, not perfection. And yet I feel like higher ed, we're so stuck on perfection that we actually lose the humanity in this work. So this is why that leading piece is really important, because we model for the folks that work with how to do it, even if we screw up, but then also to do it in a way that allows us to recognize and show that those two forces are in play at all times. And so then going to interrupting systems of oppression is that part of the reason that we're all leaders in the work that we do is because we have access to power. And so when we have access to power, we have a responsibility, to use the cheesy quote from Spider-Man, right? With great power comes great responsibility. And so how do we use that responsibility to actually interrupt systems of oppression? And for me, that's often even just ask a simple question of whose perspective is not at the table, right? If there's a room full of white people making decisions on students of color, even just say whose perspective might not be at the table is not saying how stupid are you, but it's simply inviting a reflection point that allows us to actually interrupt. That's a normal process. And interrupting, I think, also gets a really negative connotation in education and just US society at this point. But interrupting is what allows us to not do the same thing over and over again. If we wanted to do the same thing over and over again, we'd be okay with what the status quo is. So also reframing what is interrupting, and the purpose and source and impact of interrupting, I think, is really important. And then the way we do it is really important, and recognize the contextual process of if I'm talking to the president of the university versus if I'm talking to students versus if I'm talking to donors versus if I'm talking to colleagues, the way that shows up is really important. But the need, when we talk about the cycle of socialization, the other cycle that Bobby Hara uses, the cycle of liberation, and that the difference is that the cycle of socialization, unless you shift something and you have this cognizant moment of breathing and recognizing something isn't working or is not effective in line with our values, the cycle continues to just go work its magic, right? Racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, ageism, ableism, all those isms work because people, you don't have to change it because the system is built on that. And so unless you have that interruption where you kind of throw a little wrench in the process that stops something or shifts something, you can't actually start the cycle of liberation. And so that interruption becomes a critical key point in moving from allyship to, I think allyship is in the status quo, how do we make things work? Accomplishing is how do we actually take a moment to recognize where we throw the wrench and actually shift the system. And that allows us to actually rethink all the pieces that we think are necessary or needed for the work that we do.
Cultivate community for core work. This is so important. First and foremost, being able to create the community that helps to lift you up and to lift others up is what really enables you to be your best self, to be the best self to serve others. And so one of the things that's exciting, I see a couple of my own community members in this call today, and I was like, oh my gosh, hey. And so like knowing that you've got community that you can always connect with, that you can always reach out, that you can always engage in. I think for me, living in North Carolina, I've never lived in a southern state, although I'm originally from Miami. And so living in a southern state has been a very much a growing experience for me. And I have really learned to make the most of my connections and the relationships that I've built while living here within the Triangle area. So I have a really strong queer community, I have a really strong QPOC community, I have a really strong Black community. We have times where we have deck talk, and what we do is we just all come and we sit down on a deck and we have one of the most fabulous conversations. And our conversations range about how are we doing around our own self and the work that we're doing, and then how do we support each other, and then and what often happens is we are able to take that work and continue to have those conversations in the professional setting as well. And we all work at different institutions, at different parts of our institutions, and being able to bridge those connections and know that we're all doing the work. We just may not all be in student affairs. Some folks are in enrollment management, some folks are serving as faculty, but we're all doing the same type of work and we're moving this work forward together. So one of the key things is how do you figure out and find your own community to do this work? And sometimes we don't live in places where it's easy to create that community. And so if you live in a place where it's not easy to create that community, figuring out how do you create a network that may not necessarily be in proximity to you, but I think what we've learned from this pandemic is the virtual ways to connect with folks and to continue to cultivate that community it feels a little bit easier with the access to technology that we do have.
And I think for me, this piece is really connected to the compassion accountability piece too, right? Finding people who are willing to be compassionate and accountable with you, where they can say, Bobby, you really screwed up, and how can I support you in this process, right? Or I've used Bobby for say, I think I just totally put the foot in my mouth. So how do let's think to what I can do differently next time, right? So how can I minimize the harm in this moment, but how can I then align my intention with my behavior in the future, and allowing for that I'm as a verbal processor, knowing that I need to talk through with people, and knowing that there are people that I can be fully honest with. I don't have to worry about covering my feelings, or just worrying about, are they going to judge me? Like having that core work community is actually what's really helpful to make sure that when we do get deflated, allows us to recognize that we are not alone in this work, which is, I think, a key part of also the accomplishing piece in this process, rather than feeling like we somehow have to take on the full responsibility for this work. And then the last piece is to evaluate your liberation journey. I think for me, Thich Nhat Hanh, the great spiritual leader, talks about, we are a pearl on a long pearls necklace. And so our responsibility is to social justice work didn't start with us. It will not end with us. There have been thousands of people and generations that have come before that have led us to the moment that we're in. And there are generations to come that will transform things that we have never even imagined before. And so part of our job is to recognize that our responsibility is to do the work and move the needle a couple of pieces, and recognize that, he says it's like, recognize that you're a pearl, which means you're critical to the larger process. You're not separate from it, but then also recognizing where in the necklace you go, and how you, by taking your own place and taking up that space, you actually create space for the next pearl to come in. And so we have a responsibility to recognize kind of where we have growth as individuals, where we have growth as community, but also recognize that without doing our work, we cannot make it possible for the next generation to do their work. And so we have a responsibility to understand where we are and also recognize our growth edges. So I know that when it comes to ableism, that is an area that I don't think about very often. When it comes to sizes and body work, there's a lot of learning that I need to do. So one, recognize that is important, but then also not doing anything for 2 years and then saying, I don't know that area is not okay. And so recognizing when there's a webinar, when there's a workshop, when there's a new article or a new book, am I intentionally taking, even if it's not something that is automatically inviting my own energy to say, that's something I want to and need to invest energy in. Is actually a way to both evaluate where we are, but also recognize where we want to go and recognize, again, that shifting process. So I think for me, I was looking at definition of allyship the other day, and really it just means like support. Merriam-Webster says supportive association with another person or group. So it's really just like and I have we used to do these ally certificates, right? Where it was like, I'm gonna give you an award for being a decent person. And I was like, okay, we're spending more energy on making you feel good about being an ally than we're actually about supporting the community that's being impacted. And so that's not really transformative liberational philosophy. It's an important way to get people engaged. I think we know that as individuals, our egos are really important to us. So it's a good step. And so allyship, I don't think is a bad thing at all, but allyship cannot be the end point of where we want to go. Allyship needs to be the foundation. So whereas accomplishing is really about recognizing, as Lila Watson says, that I have a stake in the outcome of this process, not just to help you do what you do, but to make sure that I can live more liberated as well, right? And so I also think about Paulo Freire, who says, teacher, learner, teacher. Like, you have to be both to grow in this work. And so as someone that has power, I have a responsibility to learn and do the work, but recognize that my own responsibility, my own engagement is in this process. And also, and so for me, a similar framework that I think may help people understand is like, when you think about diversity versus inclusion, diversity is what allyship has been, right? Where it's like diversity has been the buzzword since like the 80s to now. Whereas now we're talking about inclusion, where it's really about beyond diversity. We can say we have 30% Black students, but if they're all having terrible experiences, we're not actually doing the work around liberation. And so we can't just stop at that. So allyship is good to get us involved and get people to recognize they have a personal gain in helping create inclusive spaces. But if we can actually get them to recognize that they have a critical role in interrupting and disrupting the process and actually asking critical questions, we're not actually doing the work of liberational philosophies in education, which is really missing the purpose of higher education specifically, in my opinion. And so I think those are really important ways that we think about accomplishing as being a very interactive and active engagement process to do. There's a personal decision for someone to actually do accomplishing work, whereas allyship is often, I think, easier in the work that we do in higher because it's kind of expected that you do that, but there's not a personal investment in the outcome of that process. So we'll go to the next slide. We're giving you a lot of info. We'll wrap up really quickly because I want to make sure we get to some Q&A as well. This piece, Bobby, do you want to do this? Do you want me to do this?
I can kick it off and then help close the gap. Right. There we go. Hold me accountable. So one of the things when we align with our intent with impact, so one of the things that's really important is being in this space, for instance, gets us past that naive place. We're engaging and we're starting to have these conversations. So thinking about where you often show up is really important. And it's also going to be circumstance based often. And so we're not always going to be in the warrior side, or we're not always going to be in the naive side. We're not always going to be silent. So we've got to actively engage in where we are at in this process. So going across this half of the pie, the perpetrator in this instance is often aggressively going with the system. And so they are one who is part of the system, but they are actually aggressively going with it. They are participating. They are partaking in it. For silent, think about someone standing on a moving walkway and passively engaging in oppression. And so you are there, you see it around you, but you're not necessarily doing anything to change this. The warrior, the fighter, going all the way to the far right. This is someone, if you're thinking about that moving walkway scenario, this is someone who turns around and they're resisting the system, but they're not necessarily making much progress because they aren't building the accomplices, they aren't building movements. And then social change agents is the one who's intentionally bringing people along to make change towards justice and liberation. And one of the things that's really important to note, for instance, as someone who's an active practitioner, the warrior, I try to be in the social change agent as much as possible. But sometimes, depending on where I'm at, I need to engage in the warrior side of things. I need to be vocal. I need to, because that maybe then gives somebody else the space to be that social change agent. And so, and I have these conversations with our students all the time because I work with student government, and student government may be the folks who come in and they may make some policy changes that work for students, but they've got these other student organizations that are out there demonstrating and doing some heavy lifting to bring awareness and the spotlight to issues that need to be spotlighted on campus. And so student government cannot do this work without these other student organizations also doing this work. Or it would take a lot longer. I think the key is to be on the right side of this, right? To be on the social change agent side, to be on the warrior fighter side. Silence, one of the challenges with silence is it's because we're afraid of misstepping. We're afraid of doing something wrong. But if we go back to what we talked about being an accomplice means, if you can keep those components continuously as part of who you are, you move from that silent aspect into the social change aspect. You start to move forward and cultivating your community and lifting the community up and being together for positive change. We want to make sure that if you keep the accomplice in your heart, you keep all of those steps as part of you, you'll continuously engage in that social change agent. But the key is you've got to always identify and check where you are at in a space and in a process at every single time that you are wanting to actively engage in being an accomplice. And so to not do that and not hold ourselves accountable to just knowing where we're at, it's about perspective. And the more perspective you have and the more you hold yourself accountable and keeping in touch with that, the more you are helping the communities that you want to help.
Yeah, that was great. I'm gonna just add 2 points to that. One, I think often silence shows up because either there's some fear around social impact of what that means, or there's often a fear of physical violence or harm to someone. So I think, so silence doesn't always have to be necessarily it could be a coping mechanism or a preservation mechanism, but often if that's our go-to mechanism for everything, especially when there's a room full of both people who are marginalized and people who are agents, then it often silence equals consent. You know, if we don't, if someone says that's so gay or that's retarded or something that we don't agree with, that doesn't align with our values, and yet we don't say it because it's the president or it's the president of our club or something, and we don't actually do it, then it often then becomes a culture that's a normalized experience, and often puts the burden on people who have that marginal identity to speak up and take up work for themselves, which often then becomes allyship rather than accomplishing. Because when we have power, we have the agency to actually do something without necessarily having the same level of impact on our own identity or experience or ability to take up space or cultural capital. And so that's the accomplice piece, is recognizing when to actually take up space. And when sometimes maybe you do have to be silent, but thinking about not just being something, then actually addressing it later on. And then the pieces that naive, you know, when someone tells you that you shouldn't say the word retarded, but you keep saying and say, oh, I'm sorry, I just forget, or you misgender someone, or you just, you're actually perpetrating this harm, rather than saying you're just not, you can't just say, I don't know 10 million times when someone's told you more than once. Once someone's told you, you actually are no longer in that naive category for any of those identities or experiences. We'll quickly run through 2 more slides, and then we'll make sure we have about 10 minutes for Q&A, because I know people need to get going as well. So the question that we often ask ourselves when we're thinking about how to become more accomplice-based educators, when we're in a room full of decision makers, you know, if Bobby's in a room full of student leaders, to say, whose perspectives are not the table, or who's, because often I think people say, well, whose voice is not at the table, which often then puts the responsibility of the marginalized identity to take up space and then do the work. But, I can't necessarily be the voice of a marginalized identity, but I can have a perspective of someone who's maybe not at the table. So even though I might not have a visual disability, I can say, okay, well, does this event have a ramp? Right? Or like if someone that's an immigrant or someone that's undocumented comes to this event, are they going to feel welcome in this event? And so thinking about even just asking whose perspective are not at the table and just asking everyone to reflect on that can be a transformative experience and helping people think about beyond their own lived experience and how that might show up in spaces. Because often when you say whose voice is not at the table or who is not at the table, often becomes that one Black female trans person who has to talk up for everything and is on 7 million committees. And then we wonder why they're not doing well in school. And then what is my own framework? Really being aware and owning your own framework for why and how you do your work and your own learning edges is an incredible part of that learning. Again, that right half of the table is actually where I think transformative work happens. The left half is pretty and looks good and makes us feel like we did some big impact. But if we get to the right half of that table of oppression unpacking, we can actually do transformative work, especially around accomplice-based liberatory work. And then really owning and addressing why it's important to my own liberty, rather than saying, I just want to be a good person, or I need to do this for my students or for this community, or because I have someone who is this identity, to say, how does this impact, how does the liberation of people with a disability or people with linguistic differences help me become a better person in myself and my own ability to be a human and take up space in ways that I'm actually able to be transformative is really important. And then really just, I think we talk about anti-Blackness a lot, particularly in kind of in a, I'm going to call it a post-George Floyd world, for a lack of a better word. But really thinking about how is all the ways that we work, the systems that we use and operate and normalize are inequitable in themselves. And so if we want to actually do liberatory work, we have to actually question why we do things and how we do things and how we can actually do things better that don't allow us to actually perpetrate the systems that don't actually work with us. And then really think about how can I foster community guided by core of liberation? What does it actually mean for us to create community that's transformed in the work that we do? My last slide that we're going to share, well, we'll do 2 more slides, but this one is just the compassion and accountability are leadership strategies. I think those are really important. And often we feel like accountability has to be somehow punitive, but I think compassion can be incredibly powerful in accountability, and accountability can be incredibly powerful in being a compassionate leader. And so helping people take charge for what they're responsible for, but also recognize that they're human, but not using it as an excuse is really powerful. So if we can learn how to coexist those 2 frameworks, I think it really does allow us to, beyond a business strategy, create an equitable human strategy. And so in trying not to make a lecture, we've kind of created a 50-minute lecture. So we're going to actually give you all some space to maybe just ask questions. If you want to pop a question into the chat box, or you're also welcome to just unmute and also reflect on anything that you've heard Bobby and I talk about, or any questions that you have for us.
Raja, as folks are thinking about their questions and processing, do you want me to share that document in the chat feature with folks?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
See, I knew I was going to forget that, so I told you to do it. So Bobby and I, we did this workshop for our campus about a year ago. And so we actually created a worksheet around reflection questions to help us guide in our own work. So we're going to share this with you as a freebie. So take this and work with it, play with it, do your own reflection on it, share it with us if you want us to learn about it. And then if you're going to use it with us, please make sure you give us credit for it. Feel free to modify it. But I think knowledge is useless if it's not shared. So we're going to share this with you. But it's a great tool to just take some time to reflect on yourself, do some mindful breathing, and just answer some of these prompts and really sit with your own work so that we can actually undo that right side of that oppression table.
Fantastic. Thanks for that. Any questions from folks, either sharing in the chat or unmuting yourself and commenting or asking a question to Raja or Bobby?
Chris put in, hi, Chris. The practice mindful breathing piece reminded me of something I heard recently. I'm in a choir and I'm taking my breath now. Sometimes I feel obligated to keep working hard for a movement to my detriment. It's hard to remind myself to recharge. Thanks for that reminder. Yeah, we don't have to do this work like I think there's so much ego involved. I feel like I have to do all this work, and I think it goes with that pearl piece of recognize that we're not the only pearl, that we're an important pearl. We're not the only pearl, and the necklace is really long, and that this work does not start nor end with us. For me, at least, has helped me take off some of that burden of like being the warrior fighter to becoming a strategic social change agent. So I'm not having to have to fight all the time. And I can actually make sure that I'm taking care of myself. As I told someone recently, you can't be part of the movement if you're dead. So you have to actually take care of yourself. Other comments or questions or things that you're sitting with, the things that you don't like about this framework or idea?
Raja and Bobby, I suspect that if it's quiet right now, it's probably because there are a lot of people like me that are like, yes, thank you for sharing this. I appreciate these thoughts and this framework for sure. I see a comment here in the chat from Frederick. It's good to see. Yeah. Oh, here come all the comments.
Yes, and we know this is like a 4.5-hour workshop that we did. We try to condense into a 15-minute piece just so we can. And again, I think as my grad school faculty said, I don't expect to read all of it or know all of it right now, but I expect you to know where it is when you need it. And so our goal is to give you a lot of seeds and nuggets so that at least it's sitting with you, and then you can take it and allow it to sprout as you will and use it as will be helpful, so we can all become liberatory educators.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'd like to share too, as people are thinking about this and processing this, that next week we will share the links to the recordings from this session and the others that take place this week to everyone who's registered for any of the sessions this week. So maybe that is a time for you to take a breath to rewatch some sections, or to take a breath as you send that link to someone else that you think would benefit from learning about Accompliship as well. But Raja and Bobby, I just want to thank you both for your time and your expertise as well in sharing with us in such an open and inclusive space as well. And thinking about, we're all at different places and learning about how to be an accomplice and how to be better at being at the table in ways that help to contribute to our liberatory processes too. So thank you both so much for your time. I do truly appreciate it. I do want to share that for many of you, maybe you don't know about LeaderShape, that as a not-for-profit organization, we do offer these virtual conversation series throughout the year. We hope to do another one over the summer as well, when maybe we all have a little bit more time to take a breath and don't feel as busy as we do in mid-April right before the end of the semester. But we do offer other in-person and virtual programs as well. If you'd like to read more about us, we'll continue to be a not-for-profit organization that provides these programs for free. But if you'd like to make any kind of contribution, there's a link there for you to do so. I do see a question here from Meryl about resources to use to get this workshop together. And so I think if you have a link to resources, Bobby and Raja, that you can share in the chat, or if that's perhaps a follow-up conversation that you'd like to have with Meryl.
Yeah, Meryl, if you can send Bobby or I an email, we can probably give you a couple more things. We've mentioned them, but they might not have actually been linked, but we can definitely send you a couple of links that would have been helpful for us in shaping this together.
Mm-hmm. And Raja and Bobby, if you have links that you wanted to share with us, we can post those in the comment section or the description of this recording on YouTube when we post that as well. So that will be available. I will stop sharing so we can just see the faces of everyone that's joined us in this space. But if anyone else has questions or thoughts that they'd like to share, please feel that you can do so.
It's just nice to see so many cool people from incredible accomplices in this work. I want to call out Leela, someone that has helped me become a better accomplice in this work, as someone who was a supervisor from years ago and still someone that continues to inspire the way that we do this work. So thank you for being here, Leela.